June 1942. Over the Coral Sea. The Pacific sky was blinding. The sun burned white above endless water, and the smell of salt mixed with the tang of engine oil. A squadron of Japanese A6M Zeros sliced through the clouds like silver knives, their pilots calm, confident, untouchable. Below them, smoke from burning U.S. carriers drifted like ghosts across the horizon. Inside the lead cockpit, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, adjusted his flight goggles and smiled. He'd already shot down 3 American Wildcats that morning, clumsy, slow, and doomed from the moment they appeared. The Americans fought bravely, yes, but bravery wasn't enough. The Zero was the perfect predator, faster, more agile, with a climb rate no Allied fighter could match. Its pilots called it Ryzen, the Zero Fighter, for its model year, 1940. To them, it symbolized something pure: speed, precision, invincibility. When Sakai banked his aircraft and saw the last Wildcat dive toward the sea, he radioed to his wingman in amusement. "Another one tries to run. They never learn." The Pacific War had a rhythm then, one that always ended the same way: Japan triumphant, America bleeding. But beneath that endless blue, something was changing. On the decks of American carriers, new machines were being assembled, larger, heavier, stranger. To the Japanese, they looked awkward, almost laughable. The first time they saw one, the reaction was universal. They laughed. In the summer of 1943, reports began to reach Japanese pilots from scattered skirmishes across the Solomon Islands. American forces were fielding a new fighter, a thick-bodied, broad-winged brute called the F6F Hellcat. It didn't look fast. It didn't look graceful. To the Zero pilots, it looked wrong. Sakai himself reportedly dismissed it as another fad American mistake. But then the first dogfights began, and the laughter stopped. The Hellcat wasn't designed to dance. It was designed to win. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, produced nearly twice the power of the Zeros. Its wings were armored. Its self-sealing fuel tanks meant it didn't go up in flames from a single bullet. The Japanese still had the edge and maneuverability, but the Hellcat could dive faster, climb steeper, and take punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. It was heavier, yes, but that weight was power. One Hellcat pilot later said, "You could feel it in your bones. This wasn't a plane. It was a weapon." By early 1944, Japanese pilots began noticing something unsettling. The skies that had once been theirs weren't anymore. At first, they assumed it was luck, a bad day, an unlucky formation. But then the pattern repeated. Zeros began falling faster. American pilots began climbing higher. They'd face a flight of Hellcats, lose half their formation, and return home shaken, whispering to each other in disbelief. The word spread quickly through airfields from Rabaul to Truk Lagoon. The new American fighter cannot be beaten. But pride is a powerful thing. Japan's veteran pilots still believed in their training, their honor, their machine. So when orders came for one last engagement over the Marianas, they strapped in, confident that their skill would overcome whatever the enemy had built. They didn't know they were flying straight into the day Japan would lose the sky forever. Because what waited for them, there wasn't just another battle. It was the end of their dominance. June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The morning began with a rising sun glittering off carrier decks. The ocean below was calm, unnervingly so, as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from their carriers, their engines screaming in unison. Nearly 400 Zeros and bombers climbed into formation. Pilots grinned behind their goggles, the same confident swagger they'd carried since Pearl Harbor. Many had painted cherry blossoms on their fuselages, the symbol of death and honor. But what they didn't know was that across the horizon, America was waiting. Atop the deck of the USS Lexington, Hellcat pilot Ensign Alexander Vrashu adjusted his oxygen mask, watching the sky shimmer with sunlight and tension. He had 15 confirmed kills to his name, and today he was hunting more. Below him, the Hellcats were already roaring to life, one after another, catapulted into the air by massive hydraulic launchers. Mechanics waved them off like spectators, sending gladiators into the arena. Radio chatter filled the air. Enemy formation inbound, bearing 320. Altitude 20,000. The Japanese called it Operation Ego. The Americans would remember it as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. As the Zeros approached, their formation was perfect, tight, disciplined, beautiful. But they didn't see what was waiting for them. High above, invisible against the sun, dozens of Hellcats were already diving to intercept. The first burst came from Vrashu himself, his 6.50 caliber machine guns shredding the lead bomber before it could even turn. Flames erupted from its wings as debris rained down into the sea. Moments later, the entire sky exploded. Tracer fire crisscrossed the blue expanse. Contrails twisted into spirals. Planes turned into falling comets. Within the first 15 minutes, over 100 Japanese aircraft were gone. Pilots who had once dominated the Pacific were now trapped in their own nightmare. Outgunned, outnumbered, outflown. They tried their favorite maneuvers: the climbing loop, the sudden dive, the barrel roll that once made the Zero untouchable. But the Hellcats didn't follow like the old Wildcats had. They anticipated. The F6F was faster in every direction. It could dive steeper, climb harder, and take hits that would rip the wings off a Zero. What's worse, it had radar guidance from the carriers below. The Japanese pilots weren't just fighting men anymore. They were fighting a network. One Hellcat ace, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, would later describe it like this: "It wasn't combat anymore. It was slaughter." By midday, the once proud Japanese squadrons were reduced to scattered survivors. Vrashu alone shot down 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes, a feat that made even his fellow pilots stare in disbelief. The U.S. Navy pilots had a grim saying that day: "We're not fighting them. We're burying them." When the Japanese returned to their carriers, those few who did, the decks were silent. Many of their officers refused to speak. A flight commander was overheard whispering to his mechanic, "They have built something we cannot fight." In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost over 350 aircraft, nearly its entire frontline force. The Americans lost 29. That was the moment everything changed. For the first time since 1941, the Zero was obsolete. The myth of its invincibility, the legend that had terrified Allied pilots for years, was gone. And the Japanese pilots knew it. They had mocked the Hellcat's bulk, its size, its brute American design. But now, every time they saw that round nose and broad wings silhouette appear in the sun, they didn't see clumsiness. They saw death. As night fell over the Philippine Sea, U.S. carriers were illuminated by burning wreckage on the water. Pilots were greeted by cheers, coffee, and handshakes. Meanwhile, miles away, Japanese sailors stood silently on their decks, staring at the empty skies where their plane should have been. The ocean smelled of fuel and fire. And in that silence, one truth became undeniable. The age of the Zero was over. The empire that once ruled the air had just met the industrial might of a nation that refused to stop building, and now refused to lose. But the Hellcat's story wasn't finished, because what came next, the push across the Pacific, would prove that its real power wasn't just in how it fought, but in what it allowed America to become. Late 1944, the Western Pacific. The sea was no longer quiet. It roared. It churned with power. And above it, the U.S. Navy ruled an empire of steel and thunder. By now, the F6F Hellcat wasn't just another fighter. It was the symbol of dominance. Every carrier in the Pacific had them. Every Japanese pilot feared them. On the deck of the USS Enterprise, rows of Hellcats waited under the blazing sun, wings folded like sleeping beasts. Mechanics moved between them, sweating through their shirts, tools clanking, the smell of fuel and salt thick in the air. Flight crews wore oil-stained uniforms and thousand-yard stares. They had seen the change firsthand, from survival missions to overwhelming victories. In 1942, U.S. pilots had prayed to make it home alive. In 1944, they prayed for more targets. From the Philippines to the Marshalls to the Bonin Islands, the pattern repeated again and again. Hellcats swept in, precise, organized, unstoppable, while Japanese defenses scrambled to respond with whatever aircraft they had left. Sometimes, the defenders were veteran aces, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor. But more often, they were boys barely out of flight school, trained in weeks, not years. The U.S. pilots could tell instantly. The movements were sloppy, the formations broken, and when a Hellcat closed in, it was over before the Japanese pilot even saw it coming. It felt like chasing ghosts, said one Hellcat pilot. They were there, then gone. You didn't even have time to feel anything. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, the Hellcat claimed over 5,000 aerial victories, nearly 75% of all kills scored by U.S. Navy and Marine fighters. Its kill-to-loss ratio? Nearly 19-1. No other fighter in history had achieved anything like it. And it wasn't just the aircraft. It was the system behind it, the production, the training, the logistics. Where Japan built one fighter a week, America built dozens a day. Where Japanese pilots ran out of fuel, Hellcat pilots had supply ships following them across the ocean. It wasn't a duel anymore. It was industry versus ideology. And the ideology was burning out of the sky. One survivor, a Japanese pilot named Keniyoshi Muto, described his shock after his first encounter with the Hellcat. It could dive faster than anything we had ever seen. I tried to pull away, but it was behind me before I could blink. Another pilot compared it to fighting the wind. It wasn't that the Zero had become worse. It hadn't changed at all. It was still the same agile, elegant fighter that had once terrified the Allies. The world around it had just moved on, and that world was American, industrial, relentless. In one engagement over the island of Saipan, a Japanese flight leader radioed a desperate call to his base. They are everywhere. They are many. Minutes later, his transmission cut off. That phrase, "they are many," spread through the ranks like a ghost story. Pilots whispered it in mess halls and airstrips, knowing what it meant. The Americans didn't win with a single ace or a single aircraft. They won with volume. For every Zero Japan lost, America replaced 10 Hellcats. For every pilot downed, 2 more took his place. And the Japanese pilots, proud, skilled, fearless, were now being swallowed by the one thing they had never faced before: inevitability. By the end of 1944, the Hellcat had done what no one believed possible. It had erased Japan's air superiority completely. Entire battleships sailed into combat without fear of aerial attack. Bombers flew over Tokyo without a single Zero in sight. For the first time in years, American sailors could look up and know the sky was theirs. It was a strange kind of peace, one built not on hope, but on total control. Still, inside the cockpits of those Hellcats, there was no celebration. Just silence. Because even as they soared toward victory, they knew what it had cost, and what it would still cost before the war was over. And soon, that cost would come home, in the form of a new enemy, one no aircraft could stop. Spring, 1945, the skies above Okinawa. The Pacific wasn't blue anymore. It was gray. Gray with smoke, gray with ash, gray with ghosts. Below, the island of Okinawa burned. Thousands of ships filled the waters, the largest fleet the world had ever seen, while waves of aircraft screamed overhead. Among them were the last of Japan's once mighty Zeros. They no longer soared in proud formation. They came in ones and twos, each carrying a single bomb, each piloted by a man who had already accepted his death. The kamikaze. For the Hellcat pilots who faced them, it was a haunting sight. These weren't the same confident enemies they'd battled over the Coral Sea or the Marianas. These were boys, desperate, determined, and doomed. Their planes rattled with age, their engines coughing smoke before even reaching altitude. From his cockpit aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Harold Hal Cook watched a formation of kamikazes rise from the coastline below. The radio crackled. Enemy aircraft inbound. Range, 30 miles. All Hellcats, intercept. Cook throttled forward. The Hellcat's engine roared to life, steady and smooth, the sound of raw American power. He pulled up, the ocean falling away beneath him as the first kamikazes appeared in the distance, sunlight glinting off their canopies. The Japanese pilots flew straight and unwavering, a slow, terrible procession. Cook fired a burst. 1-0 disintegrated midair. Another burst, another gone. But they kept coming. Even crippled, they refused to turn away. One kamikaze, its wings aflame, dove toward a destroyer below, the pilot visible for just a moment through the flames, calm, focused, resolute. Seconds later, the ship vanished in an explosion that shook the sea itself. Cook blinked through the smoke. His voice cracked as he whispered to himself. They don't even care if they live anymore. The Hellcat had turned the tide of the war, but it hadn't killed Japan's will. It had only cornered it. Back in Tokyo, Japan's top commanders knew the truth. Their pilots were gone, their fuel reserves dry, their aircraft obsolete. But still, they sent what was left into the sky, not to win, but to die with honor. And so, the final chapter of the Zero, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was written in fire and salt water. Over Okinawa, over Leyte Gulf, over the vast Pacific expanse, Zeros burned by the hundreds. For every kamikaze that struck, 10 were cut down before reaching their targets. Hellcats dove through flak and smoke to intercept them, sometimes colliding midair to stop their dives. The once feared Japanese fighter, agile, elegant, and undefeated in 1941, had become a symbol of desperation. By the summer of 1945, the numbers spoke for themselves. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,163 Japanese aircraft, the highest kill count of any Allied fighter in the war. Its pilots had rewritten the rules of air combat, and in doing so, erased Japan's air force from the sky. But the men who flew the Hellcat didn't brag. Many of them felt haunted by what they saw in those final battles. An enemy too brave to surrender, too broken to survive. As one U.S. pilot wrote in his diary, "They laughed at us once. Now, I wish they still could." When the war finally ended in August, the airfields across the Pacific fell silent. Rows of Hellcats sat parked under the tropical sun, their engines quiet for the first time in years. On the other side of the ocean, Japan's air bases were graveyards, twisted wrecks of Zeros, their cherry blossoms faded to ash. The machine that had once ruled the skies was gone, replaced by a new king, heavy, loud, and unrelenting. Yet even among the victors, there was respect, because the Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had inherited its legacy. Speed, precision, courage, different philosophies, same blood. The final irony was cruel and poetic. Grumman engineers had studied captured Zeros to perfect the Hellcat's design. In a way, the Japanese fighter had given birth to the weapon that destroyed it. As the sun set over the Pacific one last time, a lone Hellcat circled above a quiet ocean, its engine purring, its pilot watching the horizon where the war had begun. The sky was empty now. No enemies, no allies, just silence. And in that silence, one truth remained, carved into history by the roar of engines and the will of men. The war in the air had started with the Zero, but it ended with the Hellcat. Yendi,